Well, good evening, everyone. Wonderful to be with you this evening for our Lent course. Oh dear, I haven't got COVID, honestly. I just had it, and it wasn't much fun, so I don't want it again. So no, I'm fine. Just a reminder that Easter publicity's out, and so please do pick up some, pop them through neighbours' doors. The big thing just to remind us of coming this weekend is Saturday from 10 till 2. We've got our Easter event with coffee shop, and so that's lots of stuff going on there on Saturday. And then Palm Sunday, we've still got our 8:30 a.m. quiet communion, but then we have got 10 o'clock, we're meeting outside to process down to the War Memorial, where we're going to have a short outdoor service, because it's Palm Sunday, with a donkey as well. So there we go. You might be able to pet the donkey. What more do you want to do on a Sunday? So that should be much fun. And back here for hot cross buns and refreshments afterwards. We're on to session 5 of our Lent course today. And it's great to see you here. Great if you're joining us online as well. And we're going to begin with a short time of worship. So Matt's going to come forward. Why don't we stand together? And I'm sure some of us have come from busy days, whether that's been working or looking after grandchildren or various other things. So it's a good time just to be still before we come and worship this evening. Let me just pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of being able to meet together this evening. As we come to you in worship, I pray that you will speak to us, and may our hearts and minds be open to you. Amen. Matt.
I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unto thee, singing how marvelous, how wonderful that my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. He took my sins and my sorrows, he made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary, and suffered and died alone, singing how marvelous, how wonderful that my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. And with the ransomed in glory, his face I at last shall see. And it will be my joy through the ages to sing of his love for me, singing how marvelous, how wonderful that my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior. Sing, you are good. For you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, and let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. And let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. For you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, he is my song. For you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, you're never gonna let me down. 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 For you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, yes, you are good, good. Oh.
Amen. Would you please be seated? Last week, we had a fantastic session where Claire unpacked the previous chapter of the book, passing on the story of Jesus. And I'd encourage you, if you missed that, to catch up with it on YouTube or Facebook over the coming week. We're reminded last week that the evangelism is not all about us and our kind of clever strategizing. Rather, it's about doing and joining in with what God is already doing in that place. And this week we're looking at chapter 6 of Hannah's book, finding echoes of the story of Jesus in our world today. And we're going to watch our intro video.
Hello and welcome to week 5 of the Big Lent Read. We're going to be looking at chapter 6 this week of my book, Living His Story. And chapter 6 is called Finding Echoes of the Story of Jesus in the World Today. Building a bridge to the good news through books and films. Now, I love buying presents for people. I love standing in a shop and looking and imagining what might really suit somebody and imagining their face when they open the present. We know, don't we, that when we receive a gift, it's not always the biggest or the most expensive present that means the most to us, but those that were bought with us in mind, where someone has imagined what we might like. We're going to be thinking this week about how we can tell the story of the gospel in a way that bears the other person in mind, in a way that builds connection points with people's interests and understanding. And the best example of this, of course, is in the Apostle Paul's visit to Athens. And that's the story that we unpack in this chapter of the book. Looking at Paul as he goes to Athens and spends time looking at this new and unfamiliar city. Learning what the poets write, learning what the literature of the day has to say, the philosophical ideas. And then the way Paul communicates the gospel is done so with those ideas in mind, so he can make connection points with those who are listening to him. Now, the gospel, as we have seen over these 5 weeks, is a story. It is the story of the good news of Jesus Christ. And this gospel concerns 4 big questions at the heart of the universe. And these questions can be found in all kinds of places. The first question that the gospel raises is, who are we? What does it mean to be human? The second question the gospel raises is, what's wrong with the world? Why do we experience and see injustice and suffering? What is the problem in human life? The third question that the gospel raises and answers is, what's the solution? What has God done in the person of Jesus Christ to deal with the fundamental problem at the heart of human life? And the fourth question the gospel asks and answers is, what is the future? What does the future hold? Is there life after death? What is the hope that Christians hold on to? Now, as we become more confident as witnesses of Jesus, we need to learn how to articulate the answers to those questions, to learn how to be able to speak into those 4 big questions. But the fact is, we can also learn to identify where those questions surface in our culture. Now, many of us, as I said in an earlier week, have enjoyed, during lockdown, escaping into Netflix and movies, as finding stories as a way of escaping the world. But what might it be to look at those stories as clues which point to those big questions of the gospel? In virtually any book we might read or film we might watch, it will raise and engage with one of those questions. And how, like Paul, can we become better at not just saying, did you like that film or did you enjoy that series on Netflix? But instead to ask questions like, what do you think that film was saying about the state of the world? What do you think that film was saying about the future and our future? Did you agree with it? Did you disagree with it? Using books and films in this way can be a great way of moving conversations on from the superficial, where we focus on our preferences and our likes, onto deeper questions. And once we find ourselves having a conversation about what does it mean to be human, or a conversation about the future of the world, then we are, as Paul found in Athens, just a step away from the good news of Jesus, and we can speak of our faith with real credibility and honesty. So I'd encourage you this week in your groups to bring along a film or a book that you have recently read, and to think about, how do the themes of this story or this film connect with the good news of Jesus Christ? So we might learn, like Paul did in Athens, to make the connection between God's story and the stories in the world around us.
Brilliant. And that's what we'll be exploring today in our short time together this evening. And we're going to have our Bible reading now, and Claire's going to come and bring that from Acts 17, 16 to 34.
Hi everyone. In Athens. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needs anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, we'll go with that, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Claire, and well done for that last little bit with lots of difficult names. I'm so pleased. I wasn't reading that because they would have come out totally wrong. If you've got the text in front of you, that's great. If not, that's okay too. But we're just going to explore that passage from Paul this evening. We're going to have a quick think as well and touch on Hannah's comments in her book as well. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to travel to some of the most amazing cities of the world. I myself have not had a vast deal of experience of visiting cities abroad, mainly because I hate flying, but I have managed a couple. I've managed Orlando, Houston, Atlanta in the USA, Kobe and Osaka in Japan, and of course, because I'm English, Paris as well. We've all been to Paris, haven't we? I should also mention that I did live in one of the most amazing cities of the world till my early 20s, which is, of course, London. Very good. Was that a boo at the back there I just heard? But for some of you, you may have seen the amazing sights of Times Square or the Empire State Building in New York, or maybe the Taj Mahal in Agra, India, or even further afield like the Sydney Opera House in, of course, Sydney, Australia. For Paul in our reading this evening, it is the first time he has visited the great city of Athens in Greece. And on arrival, he finds himself alone in what can be described as the cultural capital of the world, a city that looked aesthetically magnificent and had an unrivaled reputation as a kind of intellectual metropolis. For Paul on arrival, he could have done what most of us probably would have done, grabbed his camera and set off for a sightseeing tour of the great buildings and monuments. He could have spent his time wandering around the citadel or vast art gallery, but he didn't. For Paul, none of these things struck him as what he found straight away, and what he could not get past was the sheer amount of idolatry which was going on there. Luke describes it as not just being full of idols, but rather swamped or submerged by them. There were temples, shrines, statues and altars to many different gods, not just in stone, but in gold, silver, ivory and marble. So how did Paul react to this idolatry? Well, it says it in our reading today in verse 16. He was greatly distressed by what he saw. He was distressed because this amazing city was giving honour and glory to idols rather than the one true God. I wonder, as we look around our villages, our towns, our cities, today we are stirred like Paul by what we see going on. You see, idolatry comes in many different shapes and sizes. An idol is any person or thing that occupies the place where God should occupy in our and others' lives. And in our society, idolatry can often be shown when we start worshipping and putting worldly pursuits ahead of our worship and following Jesus. Pursuing fame, wealth and power, sex, food, alcohol, spouse, children, friends, work, recreation, television, possessions. All these things plus many more can get in the way of putting Jesus first in our lives. And I think these sort of idolatries are rife in our society. I wonder if we're distressed by that, by what we see. And if we're not, why could that be? And so we see Paul is greatly distressed, but how does he respond? Did Paul get the first boat out of there? Did he do a runner? No. Did he throw his hands up in the air in despair? Did he rip his clothes? Did he weep helplessly? No. Did he launch into a verbal attack on them, swearing and cursing and telling them they didn't have a hope? That maybe sometimes we see people in the central Birmingham doing? Thankfully not. Instead, he uses the opportunity to share the fantastic news about Jesus using the culture he finds himself in the hope that they would turn from their idols and instead worship the living God. But notice that he does this with wisdom, with grace, and with clarity. And by doing it in this way, he provides us with an effective model for how we can present the gift of the gospel in such a way that it relates to people's deepest longings and connects with the culture around us. And in chapter 6, if you've read it, Hannah helpfully shows the steps that Paul takes. So firstly, Paul, he looks and he listens. He spends time taking it all in. He walks around the city. He observes. He sees what's going on. So he can fully understand the people that he is eager to share the good news of Jesus with. I think it was Karl Barth that said when a sermon's preached, it should be preached with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. And we do try to preach like this at St. John's, finding links between the culture of what's going on and gospel truths also. And in the same way, we need to be attentive and listening to what is going on around us. What films are popular at the moment? What books? What's the latest going on in the news and around the world? What are people's fears at this time? What are people's idols at this time? When I was a youth worker many, many years ago, I used to joke that I had to watch all the crazy films that kids were watching on at the cinema. I had to play all the latest video games, or I even had to listen to the expletive music that the young people were getting down to, because it was all part of my job. But there was some truth in that, because it helped me understand what the young people were into. It helped me to understand the culture that they were in, that they were caught up in. And evangelism is about becoming skilled observers and listeners. We need to hone our ability to notice what is going on around us and to understand what it says about what other people cherish as most important in life. Secondly, then, Paul gives credit where credit's due. Paul may be distressed, and he was distressed by the idols that he sees around him, but he begins his speech on a positive note of affirmation. He says this: "I see how extremely religious you are in every way." He finds a point of connection. He finds a place that he can build a relationship of trust and respect from. Paul's opening comment to them was that they were very religious. It was an affirmation of their hunger for spirituality and their kind of ultimate search for God. And don't we often find gospel themes today in mainstream films, in TV, in books, and in music? Themes of redemption, of forgiveness, of salvation, of grace, of love, the battle of good over evil. All these themes and more are found in our culture today. Again, back to when I was a youth worker, I remember the emergence of the Harry Potter books. And for some Christians, it was like Satan incarnate had arrived. J.K. Rowling was Satan. There were boycotts. I had kids in my youth group sneaking hardback copies around in brown paper bags like they were carrying something illegal. I think I was even told at one point that she was a practicing witch. Now, I'm not a Harry Potter fan, I'm afraid, and not because I have anything against it as a Christian. I just think it's nothing special, so apologies if I ruin that for anyone. But so many of those key biblical themes I just mentioned are found in those books. Rather than boycott, what an opportunity it was to unpack those ideas more. I mean, they're so strong that Christian books like the Gospel according to Harry Potter have been produced to unpack, to find those links, to find those steps, to find the better direction out of those books, to point to Jesus. Which leads us on to the third point in the book and what she says about Paul. Paul invites them to look at from a different angle. Paul takes what was familiar to them and to which he could affirm, but he just encourages them to kind of change their gaze and look at it from a different angle. For those in Athens, this was their search for God that was affirmed by Paul. But he invites them to look to the living God, rather, who has revealed himself not by one merely found kind of in idols or in shrines that were built by human hands. Paul builds on the foundation that is there, but he expands it and blows it wide open. So when we read a book or watch a film or watch the TV and discuss with others, we need to be looking at the deeper questions it raises, upon which we can build a conversation. There'll be some things that we can say a definite yes to and agree on, while other things we need to challenge and encourage a different perspective. For example, the movie scene currently is ablaze with superhero films, isn't it? The Avengers, Wonder Woman, and most recently, one of my favourites, Spider-Man, No Way Home. Go and see it if you haven't already. I did take a few months ago a late night trip. It was a very late, one of those spontaneous moments that are just great to have with your kids. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and I said to Isaac, do you want to go and watch a movie? And he was like, yeah. And so we drove to the cinema, we got to the last showing, and what became very clear in this film was these themes running through it, themes of redemption, themes of second chances, themes of sacrifice, themes of humility. And of course, that wonderful famous line in Spider-Man films, with great power comes great. Very good. Well, you've seen it. That's good. But we found ourselves afterwards discussing questions like, how do you cope and move on when something tragic happens to you? How do you forgive those you hate? Does everyone deserve a second chance? And now there was clearly some things that were not helpful in the film. Everything sold through violence probably being one of them. But it allowed those big questions to be discussed naturally. And it allowed us to start to look at them from a different angle. And then finally, he points to Christ. Paul uses what he has learned by taking a little pop at his discovery of altars with the writing to an unknown God on. And Paul uses it to grab their attention. He's basically saying, you've been looking in the wrong place for your worship. Let me show you the real God, the God that I know and worship. And after grabbing their attention, he shows 5 ways that God is a living God. I'd love to spend 10 minutes on every one, but I'm just going to quickly run through them. Firstly, he says that God is the creator of the universe. That's in verse 24. Secondly, he tells them that God is the sustainer of all life. That's in verse 25. Thirdly, he says that God is the ruler of all the nations. That's in that bit, verses 26 to 28. Fourthly, that God is the father of human beings, verses 28 and 29. And finally, he states that God is the judge of the world, and that's verses 30 to 31. I mean, Paul loves talking about Jesus, doesn't he? Sometimes we can never get to that bit. We do the listening well. We do the agreeing well. We might even get to looking at things from a slightly different angle. But that Jesus stuff is a little bit scary. As we reflect tonight, I want to ask you a question. Do you love talking about Jesus? Or do you avoid it at all costs? Let's listen to our culture around us. Let's find points of connection. It may be a film, a book, something in the newspaper, something else. Let's offer a different perspective in that. And let's point them to Jesus. Just as I close, before we move on to the second video, over the past 18 months or so, I've been on a leadership development course. I have to say, I find these things really difficult, being put in a group group of 35 other leaders that are highly capable, and I always find it quite intimidating. But one of the sessions, we were just sitting listening to someone sort of lecture on, and the lecturer just suddenly said, what I want you to do is I want you to get into twos, and you have to tell that other person who you've never met before your testimony in 2 minutes. Off you go. Some of you may have, if you've been brought up in church, it used to be a match, I think. It used to be told, can you tell your testimony while a match is burning? And it was really, really scary. But it got me thinking that, one, I often talk too much, and you're probably thinking that tonight. And secondly, actually, it's really hard to get something quite condensed. But actually, how much opportunity do you often have to speak to people for a long? It could just be a very quick conversation. Today, our culture is surrounded by sound bites. That's what we just lap up. So could you share your story in 2 minutes? Don't worry, I can see you all panicking. You're all thinking, I'm going to make you do it. I'm not going to make you do it. But it may be something to reflect on as we think about this evening, about connecting with culture and the ability to share something about what God has done in our life that's moulded and changed us. If you want to hear my 2 minutes, then you're going to have to offer to buy me a coffee, I'm afraid, and then I'll tell you it. All right. So we're going to stop. We're going to watch the second video. Now, the second video today is Hannah Steele again, and she's talking to Dr. Amy Irving. I think that's her name, or Irving. And Claire's laughing at me. So what is it, Claire? Oh, she's laughing. She normally corrects my dodgy pronunciations. Dr. Amy, we'll be listening to. She is an apologist who works for Oxford University. For those who don't know what apologist is, it's somebody that kind of defends the Christian faith. She does that a lot in academic campuses. And so she's just going to spend a short discussion for about 15 minutes discussing how she connects the story of God to modern life today.
Well, I'm delighted today to welcome Dr. Amy Ewing. Amy is an author and theologian, the president of the Oxford Centre for Apologetics. Thank you so much, Amy, for your time to talk with me today.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you for having me. It's great to be on.
So I'm really excited to have you here to talk a little bit today. We're going to have a conversation around chapter 6 of the book, looking at Paul in Athens and thinking about how we make connections with the gospel story and our culture today. I wonder, first of all, whether you could just share a little with us about your experience of, well, kind of what your role is and some of your experience in like trying to share the gospel today.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well, so for the last kind of 23 years, I have been involved kind of full-time, I guess, in evangelism and apologetics, supported by the OCA, the organisation I work for, but really trying to focus on, I guess, people who are outside the church, who wouldn't even necessarily consider themselves even that interested in Christianity, and trying to reach people through their questions and through those heart cries of culture. And there's been a focus on sort of 4 arenas really to do that sort of evangelism in. One is in the academy, so in universities, another in businesses, so trying to actually take the gospel into people's workplaces and see whether there are kind of forums for an encounter with Jesus at work. The other is in kind of, I guess, political spheres, so people who work in public policy as well as parliaments around the world. And then the fourth is the kind of media and arts worlds. So that has been, I mean, it's been a massive journey. I was in my 20s when I started out, and now, you know, in my 40s. But I think over that time, I've just been constantly surprised by God, I guess, at how much openness there is, even in places that seem really closed and that you would think aren't places that the gospel could be really preached. So yeah, it's been a privilege, and I've written a few books along the way and helped establish a course that we run for evangelists from all over the world to come to Oxford for a year and kind of learn how to do apologetics, how to do evangelism. Yeah.
Thanks, Amy. I'd love you to talk a little bit about some of the books that you've written. I've noticed I've just got the new edition of It's a book I've gone back to lots and lots of times and helping me have conversations with my friends about how we can trust Scripture. And I know you've just published a relatively new book on suffering. Tell us a little bit about that book and why you decided to write on that topic.
Yeah, so it's called Where is God in All the Suffering? And really that's been a book that has, I guess, taken nearly 20 years to write. It's a book that just comes out of, I guess, a lot of the experiences of pain and suffering that I've experienced in my own life and that others have shared with me along the way. I think that question of suffering, how could there be a loving God and this be the world that exists? And how could there be a loving God and what has happened to me has actually happened? You know, that is just such a massive question for so many people all over the world. So in that book, what I wanted to do was kind of break down. I think sometimes as Christians, we approach the question of suffering as a sort of blob. And then we go, right, there's an answer, and we're just going to apply it to the blob indiscriminately. But actually, the sort of suffering that a woman who's experiencing domestic violence or, you know, a woman who's been raped experiences is a different kind of suffering that you or I might experience if one of our parents dies of old age. That loss is still real, but it's a totally different kind of pain. And it's actually a different kind of question as to where God could be in it. And that's different from, you know, looking at the world and seeing sort of systemic injustice where people are oppressed on a massive scale. And that's different from kind of natural disasters or, you know, chronic illness or whatever. So in the book, I try to really address real examples. And again, I think sometimes in evangelism, sometimes in apologetics, we can do, you know, the straw man thing. We can say, well, look, here's a version of the suffering question, and here's how Christianity answers it and knocks that straw man down. But it actually doesn't answer the woman who was raped or the person who experienced child abuse or, you know, someone whose son was murdered. It just doesn't. So we need to make sure that the answers we offer really do address the lived experience of people. There's a chapter on mental illness in it too, which again I found is just the suffering of this generation is so often in that sphere of mental health. So the book is trying to grapple with what the Christian faith really does have to offer with a sort of honest articulation of the hardest forms of suffering in the world.
Thanks, Amy. And I love what you say about kind of recognising different people's situations and kind of individual contexts. And I know as part of your role, you've travelled quite a bit around the world. I wonder how being in those different contexts affects how you present the gospel, because, you know, if we're looking at Paul and, you know, how he speaks in Athens is perhaps different from how he speaks in Corinth, and I wonder whether you could reflect on perhaps some of the ways that's been true in your own ministry.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. That's a really, I think, you know, really sort of powerful question to reflect on. I mean, the obvious answer is to say that, as we know in evangelism, listening is so important. And for me, that has meant a sort of, because as you say, you know, the opportunities I've had and calling, etc., have been, you know, with that possibility of travel and going to quite diverse places. So it's kind of listening to the big trends in culture, the big picture questions people are asking, whether that's kind of fear and hopelessness. You know, 2019, the dystopian novels were topping all the bestseller lists. And we saw this kind of rise in suicide numbers. So that's like a kind of big picture question, but then listening specifically. I think about, I was in Zurich at the end of 2019. We were doing a kind of week of events in the banks and companies around the sort of city centre of Zurich, a sort of festival of evangelism. and doing events at lunchtime and sort of after work in the boardrooms and in the sort of conference suites of these big banks. And sort of knowing that big picture trend, I thought I need to know what's happening here in this city and in this nation, because you look around and Switzerland is so beautiful, so efficient. Everyone is so successful, and you're literally talking to the cream of that aspirational kind of materialistic culture. So I through conversation discovered that there'd been a sort of spate of quite high profile suicides of chairs of banks and CEOs of large companies, and then began to dig a bit deeper and look at some of the articles that were being written, and there was this sort of huge heart cry about this rise in attempts in suicide amongst young people, and the head of Zurich Hospital was quoted in a particular article. And so I found myself in one of the sort of super elite locations in a super elite city, talking about hopelessness, talking about how our pursuit of happiness in the particular form of acquiring wealth hasn't delivered what we hoped it would, and suggesting a different answer to that cry for meaning and purpose in Jesus. And it was just a really powerful experience of seeing God at work in a really unlikely place. But I think that's a sort of example of trying to do, I guess, what Paul did brilliantly in Athens, which was to look and to listen and to observe, I guess, the sort of specifics of their situation, see how the gospel then speaks to a generation at a particular time and place.
Yeah, and I guess what you were doing was not just looking at the surface, but actually kind of, trying to dig a little bit deeper. More deeply.
Yeah, trying to.
Yeah. I wonder if there's anything else from kind of Paul's ministry in Athens that strikes you. There's the listening aspect, but I wonder if there's anything else that resonates.
Yeah, do you know that there's sort of as I kind of look at that, and obviously you bring this out, Hannah, in your chapter, but as I look at the text, that first line when it comes to him being in Athens is that he was greatly distressed, that Paul was sort of deeply churned up by what he saw. It really, really mattered to him, more than an intellectual, rational level, that the city was full of idols, says Luke. So you've got this amazing combination of Paul, the kind of great thinker, the apologist, the one who then, it says he was then prompted to reason and talk and persuade and publicly speak. He was this great debater and brilliant mind, but the driving force of that was that he was sort of literally moved in his guts, in his heart. He was moved. And I think what that sort of says to me is that we can't be disinterested in people, their concerns, the culture of their cities. We can't hide in ivory towers of theory if we want to engage in evangelism and in apologetics. And I find it someone who's kind of working, I guess, at the slightly more intellectual, not super intellectual, but slightly more intellectual end of evangelism. The tendency in apologetics can be to be, super rational, cerebral, and to be really excellent in our formation of arguments and what we write, etc. But you just see this great combination of passion and intellect in Paul, and I think that's a massive challenge to us today, and something to aspire to hold those two things, and to allow the Holy Spirit, or invite the Holy Spirit to sort of disturb us. Because I know in my own life, and maybe it's something as you get older and middle-aged, dare I say it, but you sort of, you see things, and you obviously do care. I do want people to come to know Jesus. But there can be a bit of a tendency in our sort of comfort to not really be that disturbed about the state of the city, and to not really live there, not really dwell there in prayer, or just in how we make decisions because it's tiring or whatever. But yeah, Paul was greatly distressed. It really, really mattered to him. and that the city was filled with idols. So, yeah.
Yeah, lots of things you've identified there. And I suppose what I'd love to ask is, how do you then make the connection with the gospel? Because I suppose the rather simplistic thing might be to go, well, Jesus is the answer. He's the answer to our fear. He's the answer to our sense of belonging. You know, Sunday school answer, it's Jesus. And of course we know Jesus is the answer. But how do you, I suppose I'm wanting to ask, how do you kind of tease out those kind of connections and connect it to the gospel story?
Yeah, so I think it's quite different if we're, preaching a message or giving a message to where non-Christians are present, and if we're doing that conversationally. So if we're talking about sort of doing that in a message, I think one of the things Paul does brilliantly is to identify with Athens in a way that the Athenians think you've got it, that makes sense to us. And so I think the great task and calling today is to even articulate the questions and that sense of longing in a way that people think, yes, that is what I feel. Yes, that is true. And then more slowly sort of bring the connection to Jesus. So begin to ask the question, you know, one example might be, and asking questions as well as giving answers, I think is so important because it helps people come to their own conclusion, because they've got to answer that question too. So it might be something like, you know, if we're just here by chance, if we are just a random collection of atoms and a piece of slime on the face of this planet, and there's no God and there's nothing more than what materialism tells us, we're just the stuff of our bodies, why does pain hurt so much? Why does trauma impact us so much? Is a materialist explanation of reality true enough for you? Can it explain the depth of your pain? Or might it be that we were made for a better world? Could it be that we've been created in the image of a loving God, and so any violation of his image hurts at more than a physical level? And if you talk to a woman who's experienced sexual violence, she will tell you that the bruise on her arm or the tearing of her flesh is one tiny bit of the pain she's experienced through that violent act. Why? Because we're more than just our physical bodies, and her pain matters. It matters to her and those who love her, but ultimately it matters cosmically, because, you know, there's this God who lives and loves. So it's asking questions and then I guess comparing, you know, what are the alternative explanations for this? And then I think it's more difficult to do that conversationally in some senses, because it takes much longer to get there. You fall into that trap of Jesus is the answer too quickly. So questioning and listening to a person's answer, and then maybe perhaps gently probing that answer and saying, do you think that's enough? You know, in my experience, actually, I don't think a material explanation is enough for me. I feel like there's more. So that's sort of an example, maybe, Hannah.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And I like the way you kind of raise the sort of, could it be that this is...
Yes,
yeah. So you sort of, there's something of the work of the imagination in evangelism to just plot these sort of possibilities. And I think you also show that, I guess, the time it takes now for people often to come to faith, that it's rarely just an overnight kind of... Yeah, no.
So an example, you know, I think it was Pascal who said, make them wish it was true and then show them it is. So there's sort of work in apologetics of imagination and the could it be, and then more evidential. And we often go the wrong way around with those two things. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. I could seriously chat on Zoom to you all day.
Well, likewise, Hannah. And I loved your book, and everyone who's watching this, definitely get it. It's really, really fantastic.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Amy. Really appreciate talking with you. God bless. You. Take care.
Brilliant. We're going to get into groups. Probably need waking up a bit, getting moving. It's your first week, I think everyone's been before, so you probably know what groups that were working for you. So please just grab yourselves into groups. There's 3 questions tonight to think about. They should appear on the screen, hopefully. I think they're on there somewhere. Oh, it's just that screen's not on. That's why I can't see it. That's okay. So we are thinking a bit about books and films, like was mentioned earlier. So which book or film that you have recently absorbed might give you a way of sharing the gospel, or more generally talking about the big questions of life with others? Do you regularly check out some of the things causing a stir in popular culture? And if not, how might you keep yourself well informed? And in what book, film, drama, musical, TV programme or radio broadcast do you find a winning presentation of the gospel? Wow, lots to think about. And if you get through those questions really quickly, it means you're not connecting with culture, so you've got a lot of work to do. But also, maybe, if you've got that time, maybe have a go at sharing your testimony with each other, 2 minutes each, and sharing how God's changed and transformed your life. Let's get into smaller groups. And we've got about half an hour, so till 9 o'clock. Brilliant. I won't comment on some of the conversations I just had with people. I think they're better safe and sound with me. We've got 5 minutes, and I thought what would be really good, I know over the past few weeks that we've had these sort of 5 people that have been on our mind to pray for, and it'd just be really good in these last 5 minutes. It's kind of a minute for each person, isn't it, really? But maybe you just want to pray for tonight, pray about what you've learned, pray about maybe what God's challenged you on, and also to bring those 5 people again before God. If they're people that are local, we've talked quite a lot tonight about invitation, about connection. Maybe you could invite them along to Palm Sunday or Easter Sunday, which is a great service. If they live miles away, that might be a bit more tricky. But why not let's take a moment to just pray in your groups to end and maybe lift those people again, those 5 people that are on your heart tonight before we finish. is now past. As the night watch looks for the morning, so do we look for you, O Christ. So the Lord bless us and watch over us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious to us. The Lord look kindly on us and give us his peace. Amen. Look forward to seeing you soon.